The great halls of Spain once echoed with whispers, not of political intrigue or military conquests, but of something far more unsettling. A king sat upon the throne, the last of his dynasty, yet his very existence seemed to defy nature itself. His jaw jutted forward grotesquely, his tongue too large for his mouth, making speech a struggle. His head wobbled upon a frail neck, his body stunted, limbs weak. He could not walk without assistance. His skin was pale, almost waxen, and his eyes, dark, tired, and oddly vacant, as if weighed down by centuries of suffering. To foreign envoys, he was a pitiful sight, a monarch who looked more like a shadow of a man than the ruler of one of the richest empires on earth. But among the common people, the rumors went far beyond pity. They said he had been cursed, bewitched from birth, a living embodiment of the sins of his forebears. Some claimed that witchcraft had been used against him, that a dark spell had tied his body and mind in knots, keeping him childlike and powerless. Others whispered that he was the product of something far more earthly, a generations-long family tradition of marrying too close to the bloodline, sealing the fate of their own dynasty in his fragile frame. He was the last hope of the Spanish Habsburgs, and yet he could not produce an heir. His marriages failed, his health deteriorated, and every day his reign dragged Spain further into decline. Court physicians tried exotic treatments, priests performed exorcisms, and still his condition worsened. The chronicles of his life read like a catalog of human frailty: seizures, digestive collapse, crippling fatigue, and a face so misshapen that even portraits softened the truth. And when his autopsy was performed, the findings were so disturbing, so unnatural, that they only fueled the belief that dark forces had shaped his existence. But behind the superstition and horror lies a truth more tragic and more fascinating than any spell. His life was the final act in a centuries-old story of power, obsession, and a fatal misunderstanding of bloodlines. Before we reach that ending, we must go back to the glittering palaces, the royal weddings, the whispered prayers for a healthy heir, and the choices that set an empire on the path to ruin. Because this is not just the story of a king who was deformed. It is the story of a dynasty that destroyed itself, and the boy who bore the curse. To understand the life and the tragedy of this king, we must first step into the twilight years of the Spanish Habsburg Empire. It was the mid-17th century. Spain had been one of the most powerful nations in the world for over a century, its empire stretching from the Americas to the Philippines. Gold and silver poured into its ports from across the ocean. Yet beneath the glittering surface, cracks were spreading. Wars against France, the Dutch Republic, and England drained the royal treasury. The Spanish Armada's humiliating defeat decades earlier had marked the beginning of a slow decline. And at the very heart of the empire stood a family, the Habsburg dynasty, whose obsession with keeping their bloodline pure would prove to be their undoing. For generations, royal marriages had been arranged almost exclusively between close relatives, cousins, uncles, and nieces, even uncomfortably close alliances by today's standards. The goal was political unity and the consolidation of power. The result, however, was something no court physician could cure: a genetic trap slowly closing in on its royal victims. By the time our king was born in 1661, Madrid's royal court was already a place of hushed concerns. The boy was the long-awaited son of King Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. But from the very beginning, he was unlike other children. He struggled to crawl, could not speak until he was 4, and was still being fed by wet nurses well into his childhood. His head was disproportionately large. His jaw protruded in the infamous Habsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism, and his legs were weak and bent. Still, the machinery of monarchy demanded ceremony. In grand halls hung with Flemish tapestries, courtiers bowed before him, servants dressed him in rich brocade, and heralds proclaimed his titles: King of Spain, King of Naples, Duke of Burgundy, Lord of the Netherlands, a litany of lands he could barely comprehend as a boy. But the court was a dangerous place for a frail child. Every movement was watched, every word whispered about. His mother, Queen Mariana, became fiercely protective, sheltering him from public view. She insisted his condition was the work of sorcery, perhaps even the devil's handiwork, and sought the aid of priests and exorcists. These beliefs were not unusual in the Catholic Spain of the time, where superstition blended seamlessly with politics. Outside the palace walls, Spain itself was changing. The once bustling ports of Seville and Cadiz were quieter, the treasure fleet smaller, inflation ravaged the economy. Fields lay fallow as the population shrank from famine, plague, and war. Yet for ordinary Spaniards, the king was still a sacred figure, even if whispers about his health spread through taverns and marketplaces. Inside the Alcazar of Madrid, the palace's chilly stone corridors echoed with court intrigue. Ministers, nobles, and foreign ambassadors debated not only how to govern the empire, but how to manage the king's image. Public appearances were rare, carefully staged to hide his weaknesses. Portrait painters, often under royal orders, softened his deformities with brush and shadow. Still, in moments of truth, a ceremonial mass, a state procession, a royal wedding, the reality was harder to conceal. Observers noted his stiff, halting gait, the way he leaned heavily on attendants, the effort it took for him to speak. For some, predictable outcome of generations of inbreeding. And so, from his earliest days, our king's life was shaped by forces he could not control. The heavy expectations of a faltering empire, the suffocating embrace of dynastic politics, and a family tree so tangled that its branches had nowhere left to grow. It was a world where science had not yet untangled the mysteries of heredity, and where a sickly royal child was as likely to be treated with holy water as with medicine. Yet even in this fragile body, the crown sat heavy, and the kingdom's fate rested upon him producing an heir. And that was where the story would take a darker turn. In a court already thick with intrigue, rumors clung to our king like a second skin. They were whispered in the echoing halls of the Alcazar, traded in the smoky corners of Madrid's taverns, and even carried by foreign ambassadors back to their home countries. Some said that from the moment of his birth, he was El Hechizado, the Bewitched. The nickname stuck so firmly that even centuries later, historians use it to describe him. The story went that an enemy of the Habsburgs had cursed the royal bloodline, not just him, but generations before, ensuring weakness, madness, and childlessness. In a deeply religious Spain, where the line between illness and evil was thin, this idea took root easily. Priests whispered of witchcraft performed at his cradle, dark powders hidden in his food, and spells sewn into his clothing. There was even a tale that a wax effigy of the infant king had been found in the palace, pierced with needles, its heart bound in black ribbon. But superstition wasn't the only fuel for the fire. The truth of his physical deformities, his jutting jaw, oversized tongue, swollen lips, sunken eyes, and skeletal frame, was enough to make some believe he was not entirely of this world. Observers described him as looking more like a corpse than a man, and in an age where appearance was thought to reflect the soul, this made him seem unnatural. Foreign courts had their own versions of the tale. In Paris, they mocked him as a king unable to chew his food without difficulty. In Vienna, they spoke of his inability to walk without support. In London, he was whispered about as a symbol of Spain's decline, a monarch so frail he could barely rule his own household, let alone an empire. Inside Spain, the rumors took on a more ominous tone. His first marriage to a French princess ended without children, prompting speculation that the curse was working exactly as intended. His second marriage to an Austrian archduchess fared no better. Whispers grew that no woman could conceive by him, either because of the sorcery that afflicted him, or because his body was too malformed for fatherhood. And then came the exorcisms. Records tell of priests performing elaborate rituals to cleanse him of demonic influence. One particularly vivid account describes how holy water was sprinkled, over him as candles burned low and Latin chants filled the chamber, while the king himself sat slumped in a gilded chair, pale and vacant-eyed. Among the people, these stories became more than gossip. They were explanations. How else could they make sense of a monarch who seemed both pitiful and cursed, ruling over a kingdom sliding into ruin? Of course, not everyone believed in sorcery. Some court physicians privately blamed his condition on centuries of inbreeding. The Habsburgs had married so many close relatives that their family tree looked more like a tightly knotted vine. The king's parents, for example, were uncle and niece. This genetic isolation had compounded defects over generations, until it reached its breaking point, in him. But such explanations were dangerous. To openly accuse the royal family of creating their own misfortune was to risk charges of treason. It was safer, politically and spiritually, to blame witches and demons than to admit the dynasty had weakened itself from within. And so the legend of the Bewitched King endured. It was a story that blended fear, pity, and a strange fascination. To some, he was a tragic figure doomed by the sins of his ancestors. To others, he was living proof of the dangers of tampering with the natural order. Either way, every whisper, every rumor, every frightened glance in his direction deepened the aura of mystery, an aura that would follow him to the grave. But when the time came to examine his life more closely, the so-called curse began to look disturbingly real. For centuries, much of what was known about El Hechizado, the Bewitched King, was steeped in rumor. But if we strip away the superstition, what remains is a chilling body of historical evidence that paints an equally unsettling picture. The most telling clues come from official court records and medical reports from the period. Chroniclers, palace physicians, and foreign envoys all left written accounts, some candid, others carefully edited to avoid offending the crown. The physical evidence descriptions of the king's appearance were remarkably consistent. His lower jaw protruded so far that his teeth could not meet, making chewing difficult and speech unclear. His tongue was enlarged, causing a constant drooling and slurred words. His skin was pale and blotchy, and his hair, thin and brittle. He was unusually short for a man of his time and so thin that observers compared his limbs to sticks. The Habsburg jaw was not new. Portraits of earlier kings show the same jutting chin and elongated face, but in him, it had reached extreme proportions. Modern geneticists who have studied his lineage estimate that his parents shared more genetic material than a typical brother-sister pairing. Inbreeding coefficients suggest that decades of close marriage had compounded recessive traits until they became debilitating. By his teens, palace doctors noted frequent seizures, chronic digestive problems, and bouts of severe fatigue that left him bedridden for days. He struggled to walk without help and could not ride a horse without a special saddle. The diplomatic reports, foreign ambassadors, often with little to lose by telling the truth, reported bluntly on the king's condition. In 1692, the French ambassador wrote, "The Catholic king is so ugly as to cause fear, and so clumsy he can neither stand nor walk. His body is as weak as his mind." Another report from the Venetian envoy described him as incapable of managing the simplest affairs, his speech confused, his eyes without focus. Such assessments were more than gossip. They shaped the way foreign powers dealt with Spain. Rivals understood that a physically and mentally weak king meant a weakened monarchy, ripe for manipulation. His two marriages are particularly well documented and revealing. The first, to Marie Louise of Orléans, lasted 10 years and produced no children. Court rumors claimed she dreaded her husband's presence, describing their union as a marriage in name only. She died suddenly in 1689 at just 26, with some whispering that poison had been involved. The second marriage, to Maria Anna of Neuburg, was arranged with the hope of producing an heir. She came from a family known for its fertility. But after years of childlessness, the blame once again fell upon the king's frailty and, in the eyes of some, the curse. Medical reports hinted at genital deformities and impotence, though such details were shrouded in euphemism to preserve royal dignity. One of the most bizarre pieces of evidence comes from church archives. In 1698, a formal investigation into the king's supposed bewitchment was launched by the Inquisition. Testimonies from priests describe discovering bewitched objects hidden in the royal chambers, clay figurines, spells written on parchment, strange powders in sealed jars. An exorcism was reportedly performed over several days. The king was made to drink holy water, wear blessed relics, and endure chants meant to drive out demonic forces. Inquisitors claim they had removed a curse placed upon him before birth. Whether these objects were truly planted by enemies or staged to justify a supernatural explanation remains unknown. When the king died in 1700 at the age of 38, his body was examined. The autopsy report, preserved in fragments, is almost unbelievable. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His huns were corroded. Hill's intestines were rotted and putrefied. His head was full of water, possibly a reference to hydrocephalus. He had no trace of a single testicle. If these accounts are accurate, they confirm a lifetime of profound physical degeneration. His body revisited the evidence with modern medical knowledge. Geneticists suggest he likely suffered from a combination of rare disorders caused by homozygosity, the expression of harmful recessive genes due to centuries of inbreeding. This could explain the infertility, developmental delays, and multiple organ failure. Historians note that the bewitchment theory served a political purpose. It allowed the court to frame his weakness as an external curse rather than the result of deliberate dynastic choices. Admitting the truth would have meant acknowledging that the Habsburgs had, in essence, engineered their own downfall. Whatever the cause, the records leave no doubt. The man was barely capable of ruling, his reign defined by decline, and his body a living testament to the dangers of unchecked royal bloodlines. And yet, the most haunting part of his story isn't what we can prove, it's what we can't. Because some events from his life defy even the most rational explanations. Even with all the medical records, diplomatic reports, and modern genetic analysis, there are episodes in the life of El Hechizado that refuse to be neatly filed under science or history. These are the moments that kept the rumors of witchcraft alive, moments that still give his story a faint chill centuries later. The Night of the Shadows. One account from the royal chaplain describes a disturbing incident in the late 1690s. The king, already in fragile health, awoke screaming that dark figures were pressing on his chest, suffocating him. Servants rushed into his chamber to find him drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with terror. Some claimed they saw flickering shapes in the candlelight, shadows that moved independently of the people in the room. Whether this was the product of fevered hallucination, sleep paralysis, or something stranger, the story quickly spread through the court. The sudden collapse. During Mass. In 1698, during a high Mass in the royal chapel, the king suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed, his face contorted in agony. Witnesses swore they heard him whisper, "They are killing me from within." He was carried to his chambers, and although he survived the episode, it deepened fears that supernatural forces were slowly consuming him. The court physicians diagnosed it as a seizure of the heart, but the timing, during a sacred rite, was taken by some as proof that the devil's influence could not be repelled even by holy ground. The Inquisition's investigation. Perhaps the strangest and most documented of these events came when the Spanish Inquisition formally investigated his supposed bewitchment. Records claim they discovered a lead casket buried in the Escorial Gardens containing a Lao, miniature wax effigy of the king, pierced through the head and chest with iron needles, appliances of bone wrapped in black silk, parchment covered in occult symbols and Latin curses. While skeptics argue these could have been planted by political enemies, the discovery was treated with utmost seriousness. Exorcists were summoned, and the objects were burned in a public ritual of purification. The failing portrait. In 1699, the king sat for what would be his final official portrait. The painter later told confidants that the experience unsettled him, not because of the king's appearance, but because the canvas itself seemed to resist the image. Layers of paint would not dry properly, as if the figure blurred each time he tried to capture it. By the time the portrait was completed, the king looked far older than his years, his gaze hollow. Rumors spread that even the artist's brush could not contain the curse. The Prophecy. In the months before his death, a Capuchin friar is said to have delivered a cryptic message to the king's attendants. When the candle burns out, the House of Austria will end. According to palace gossip, a massive devotional candle in the royal chapel, meant to burn for years, went out suddenly during a storm just weeks before the king died. Whether this was coincidence or a staged omen, the symbolism was too perfect to ignore. The flame of the Habsburg line snuffed out with the last breath of El Hechizado. The Autopsy's unnatural twist. Even the autopsy, grim as it was, contained details that defy easy explanation. In addition to the horrifying physical decay, the physicians noted that the king's body showed no signs of decomposition for several days after death, despite the warm Madrid climate. Some saw this as divine preservation. Others whispered it was the lingering touch of dark magic, the lingering curse. After his burial, strange misfortunes reportedly struck those who had handled the bewitched objects from the Inquisition's investigation. A servant fell ill and died within months. One priest suffered a mental breakdown. Even some of the physicians involved in the autopsy met untimely ends. Whether these were coincidences or the long shadow of suggestive fear, they added to the legend that his curse outlived him. The modern skeptics versus the believers. Today, historians lean heavily toward genetics and poor health as explanations. Yet for every rational argument, there remains an incident: the lead casket, the unblinking shadows, the perfect timing of omens that refuses to be fully explained. For the people of his time, these weren't just stories, they were evidence. They confirmed what they already believed, that their king's deformities, illnesses, and childlessness were not accidents of nature, but the work of unseen hands. And perhaps, in a way, that belief made sense. It was easier to think a curse had struck than to face the truth, that the mightiest family in Europe had engineered its own destruction through its own choices. But whether cursed by sorcery or by blood, the reign of El Hechizado was drawing to a close. And when it ended, it is there.
Would change the map of Europe forever.
When Charles II of Spain, El Hechizado, died in 1700 without an heir, it was more than the death of a king. It was the death of a dynasty. With him ended 2 centuries of Spanish Habsburg rule, a line that had once commanded an empire stretching across the globe. His passing set into motion the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict involving nearly every major European power. France, Austria, Britain, and the Dutch Republic all fought to determine who would inherit Spain's vast territories. The war reshaped the political map of Europe. In the end, the Spanish crown passed to the Bourbon dynasty under Philip V, linking Spain more closely to France and forever altering the balance of power. For historians, the king's death became a clear turning point, the moment when Spain's golden age finally slipped into history. Modern science has turned Charles II into a case study. Geneticists and medical historians point to him as one of the most extreme examples of the dangers of prolonged royal inbreeding. His inbreeding coefficient was so high that it was equivalent to being the child of a brother-sister pairing. The physical deformities, infertility, and developmental delays that plagued him were almost certainly the direct result of centuries of marrying within the family to preserve political alliances. His life is now cited in both historical and medical texts as a vivid example of how the pursuit of dynastic purity can lead to biological collapse. And ultimately, political ruin. The legend of El Hechizado has never really faded. In Spain and beyond, his life has inspired plays, novels, documentaries, and historical dramas. Writers often blur fact and legend, portraying him as both tragic victim and eerie monarch touched by the supernatural. In popular culture, his story is frequently compared to fictional rulers in works like Game of Thrones, a frail king whose personal weakness mirrors the crumbling state of his realm. Filmmakers highlight the macabre details: wax effigies pierced with needles, exorcisms by candlelight, and the whispered prophecy that foretold the end of the Habsburg line. While the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, his main residence, was destroyed in an 18th century fire, sites like the monastery of El Escorial still carry his shadow. Visitors walk the same halls where he endured court intrigue, and some dark history tours retell the creepiest parts of his life, mixing archival fact with the ghost stories that grew around him. Though his tomb is not a pilgrimage site in the traditional sense, his name appears on historical plaques, museum exhibits, and in guided tours that focus on the strange and supernatural elements of Spain's royal past. Symbol of a dynasty's fall. For modern Spaniards, Charles II is less a figure of ridicule than a symbol of an ending. His reign is remembered not only for its tragedies, but for the way it closed a long, glittering, and ultimately doomed chapter of imperial history. His legacy is twofold. In the in-science, as a cautionary genetic case study. In the in-culture, as a haunting legend half-remembered between history and myth. And yet, his story still leaves one question unresolved. Was Charles II truly the victim of a curse, or simply the last tragic creation of his family's own choices? In the end, the story of Charles II of Spain, El Hechizado, is one of history's strangest crossroads between myth and medicine. His reign was marked by whispers of witchcraft, public exorcisms, political manipulation, and a body so frail it seemed to confirm every rumor. Was he truly bewitched? The evidence points more strongly to genetics than sorcery. Yet, in his own time, science could not offer such clarity. For his subjects, the language of curses and dark magic made more sense than the idea of invisible flaws written into his bloodline centuries before he was born. And so, the legend lived on, and still lives today. He became a symbol of a dynasty that rose to the greatest heights of power, only to collapse under the weight of its own decisions. His life reminds us that empires are not brought down solely by enemies at their gates. Sometimes, the seeds of their fall are sown in their own halls. When Charles II died, the candle of the Habsburg line in Spain was extinguished forever. The war that followed reshaped Europe, but the image of the pale, misshapen king lingered far longer than the treaties and battle maps. In paintings, plays, and whispered stories, he remains the bewitched king, part tragedy, part cautionary tale, part ghost in the corridors of history. Now, centuries later, his life still forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How much of what we call fate is really the result of human choices? When power is guarded so jealously that it will not risk fresh blood, is collapse inevitable? When history hands us a figure so strange, so pitiable, so shrouded in rumor, do we see the person or only the legend? What do you think? Was Charles II a victim of dark magic, cursed from birth by political enemies? Or was the true curse something far more human, written in the very DNA of his dynasty? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden corner of history, give the video a like